nobody really knows what For Women Scotland means yet.
Mm,
And if For Women Scotland really does mean all of the things that, if we're wrong, if Good Law Project are wrong, and For Women Scotland does mean all of the things that anti-trans sort of activists say it means, that it requires some nationwide bathroom ban. If
mm.
they're right, and that is what For Women Scotland means, and that's what the courts say it means, then absolutely we will be seeking to challenge that, yes.
Hello. You are about to watch my interview with Jess O'Thomson from the Good Law Project. They are the trans rep for the Good Law Project. And if you don't know, the Good Law Project are a human rights litigation group, and they've come up a lot recently for court cases around trans rights in the UK, particularly challenging some guidance from the EHRC. And they had a victory last week regarding gender recognition. So inherently, I'm skeptical because I'm always skeptical of people's interests. And so this was a really interesting conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. This is Izzy Dine Grills. I didn't realize at first when we started talking, but I have actually followed your work for ages, so this is really cool. Um, and I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with me. So I'll just get into it, um, so that
Different.
I'm not taking up too much of your time. Um, Obviously I've already asked you how you are. I think an interesting thing to sort of acknowledge before we jump into the questions is that this is actually kind of a cool thing because so often I feel like in British politics, um, you have two, or a panel of cis people sitting around talking about trans rights. Um, and today, both people on both sides of the conversation are trans, and that I think is cool and worth um,
Yeah. Cool.
acknowledging. So I think that's a cool thing. I'm very happy that we're doing this. So obviously, you're talking to me today, mostly on behalf of the Good Law Project.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm speaking on GLP, yes.
yeah. And I think for me, at least, sometimes I have had, anytime a big organization comes along and says we're going to stand up for trans people and we're really on your side, I think I get a little bit suspicious.
Yeah.
Why have the Good Law Project become so invested in sort of trans rights?
So I think it's a really interesting thing. I think Good Law Project has always obviously been um, on the side of various progressive causes,
Yeah,
right? Um, I think the thing about trans rights that's so interesting and why Good Law Project have ended up doing so much of this work is just because so few other people are.
yeah,
It's sort of by virtue of necessity of there being this whole space having been left, where sadly for whatever reason, other organizations you would expect to be doing this kind of work in the LGBT sector have, for various reasons, been unable to do that work, to continue to do that work. And I think Good Law Project has, as they say, a very progressive organization who really cares about standing up and fighting injustice has seen that vacancy has been left and has, through various coincidences and um, through a deep care, I think, of the people who work here, ended up advocating in this space and ended up being the strongest advocates in certainly on a legal front for trans rights in this country.
that makes a lot of sense. So I want to talk about the GLP had a big success in the last sort of week and a half, 2 weeks, something like that, around gender recognition. Could you tell me a little bit more about
Yeah.
kind of what happened there?
Yeah, so I was really fortunate to work on this case. So it concerned a transgender man
Hmm.
who was seeking a gender recognition certificate. And he was basically told by the gender recognition panel that they would not grant him a certificate because he was trying to conceive a child. And as far as they were concerned, that meant that he wasn't meeting the requirement to live as a man, which obviously, you need to live as your required gender for 2 years in order to be eligible for a gender recognition certificate. And we thought that was really obviously unlawful. So I'm a human rights lawyer by background. There is a whole swathe of human rights jurisprudence specifically on the fact that you cannot make it a requirement of gender recognition to require that trans people effectively are sterilized as a requirement. That's a breach of their human rights. That's a violation, and it's easy to see why, right? When you think about the history of those kind of policies and the sort of sterilization of undesirables, it's really clear why the European Court of Human Rights has repeatedly held that it's not acceptable. And so we went to court and on behalf of this trans man, and we argued that we thought it was unlawful, that it was in violation of his human rights, and the court agreed that such a requirement would be unlawful, that in saying that he had to choose between his desire to have a family and his desire to be recognized as the gender he is, that the panel were placing him in an unacceptable position. And so this is like a real landmark case that we think will help not just the trans man in the case. He's got his gender recognition certificate now, which is amazing, but which will help many, many other trans people. We've heard stories of other trans men who have been told the same thing by the panel. We're hoping that this sets a precedent that will allow trans people now to be able to obtain gender recognition.
I just want to ask a little bit more about that actually, in terms of this ruling and what kind of precedent it might set and what it might allow. Um, if there's any other work that it might allow other trans people or the Good Law Project or other kind of legal bodies to pursue, like what else it might open up at all.
So as I say, it basically means that if people are being told this by gender recognition panels now, they can go and point to this case and say, hey, court said that's unlawful, you can't do that. Which, is obviously huge. And I think it really helps build and establish further in our domestic jurisprudence a better understanding of Article 8 and the protections that that provides for trans people in terms of obtaining legal gender recognition. There's a really nice discussion of some of the case law, some of the European case law, and just how expansive it is. And so, even outside of, the context of where this is strictly precedent, I think it's likely to be, I think it's reflective or influential in a way of just how strong human rights protections for trans people and gender recognition really is. And it's nice to see the courts recognizing that, and hopefully they continue to recognize that in other arenas.
That makes sense. Do you think that when we think about the kind of fundamental uh, of the issue around gender recognition, do you think that there's an argument to be made about actually like the UK's process around gender recognition um, being kind of fundamentally flawed or a kind of anti-trans? Like, what is that something that rings true to you?
So I think it's something that's been raised across the sector for years, right? Is that very few people actually ever obtain gender recognition certificates in this country for various reasons. Previously, there were significant administrative costs associated. Those have reduced, fortunately, but there still remains a significant administrative burden. The I think it's likely to be even harder now to demonstrate the requirement to live as one's gender for 2 years when people have been put in a position following for women in Scotland where they're feeling increasingly like they're being told they can't live as their required gender. So I think it's right to say that there are really significant questions around how we do gender recognition in this country, the limited nature of the protection it provides, but I think also there are questions around um, what we do about that in a political environment where there is such hostility to trans
Mm.
people. It's really hard.
Do you find that? I mean, of course it does, I suppose. But do you find that you've been limited in what you can kind of envision yourself being able to do legally because of the kind of political climate that we're in and because of the way that kind of trans people get talked about? Does that limit what you kind of think like the amount of like progress you could kind of create might be when you think about that kind of thing?
I mean, in some ways, yes, the answer to that's obvious, right? Is that it's harder to win in an environment where it feels like everything's stacked against you. But I think in sort of more practical terms, um, speaking, as I say, with a human rights background,
Mm,
the political environment in the UK itself is to some extent immaterial to the
mm,
extent that we're in conflict with our obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights. So it might be that if we were talking purely in legislative terms of what legislation we could convince this current Labour government to pass, then yes, of course, we would be very, very limited. But the reality is if this Labour government wants the UK to remain compliant with its international law obligations, then the European Court of Human Rights has set down some quite significant um, protections for trans people, particularly, in terms of Article 8. And as you know, we're seeing quite significant political attacks on Article 8 from the far right in this country, not just in terms of trans people, particularly not just in terms of trans people, mainly focused actually on immigration and on refugees and those kind of protections. Um, but I think, yes, fundamentally, for as long as we continue to be a part of the European Convention on Human Rights, and long may we continue, we have to remain compliant. And that, as I say, has means some quite strong protections for trans people.
okay. Um, Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to talk about For Women Scotland and the Supreme Court ruling. How did that? I've heard you explain it in the past, and I think you explained it very well. How did that come to be that that judgment was made?
So, um, it's a very interesting judgment in the sense that, as I say, for an issue which touches so heavily on Article 8 and the human rights protections afforded to people with regard to legal gender recognition, there is very little, if any, discussion of the human rights implications within the judgment itself. Um, but I think perhaps the most interesting thing about For Women in Scotland is not the judgment itself, but rather the sort of political follow on from it.
Mm,
Um, so what For Women in Scotland says is itself actually incredibly limited. It's talking specifically about the definition of sex. For one piece of legislation, it doesn't necessitate that means certain things for toilets and single sex spaces. It doesn't define what a woman is in law. None of these things that we saw happen immediately afterwards and be asserted immediately afterwards, not just as regards to the Equality Act itself, but as regards to other pieces of legislation, like the workplace regulations that are relevant to which toilets trans people are accessing in an employment context. All of that wasn't in the judgment itself. It came in the form of the EHRC's interim guidance that we're legally challenging, that followed it, came in the form of quite thoughtless statements from politicians who were, I'd say, deliberately misled by certain anti-trans activist groups as to what the law was and what these things meant. And if anything, we're now sort of seeing a moderation of that position where the EHRC has pulled its interim guidance from its website. The government is now talking about ensuring that the EHRC's proposed code of practice is properly considered and looked at rather than just rushed ahead and laid. Um, so all of these statements about the clarity that For Women Scotland brought and what it meant have suddenly fallen away. And it's because actually the legal situation is incredibly complicated, um, to the point where there are very, very, very good lawyers are still debating with each other exactly what the implications of the judgment are, exactly what it means. Um, so I think it's important to not overread For Women Scotland and what it means, because the reality is as I say, no one, I don't believe anyone who tells you that we know exactly what that judgment means yet. It's going to take a good bit of time, good bit of litigation, um, and some very good lawyers making very good arguments about where the role of human rights law is in all of this, how broadly or narrowly the judgment should be construed, whether things apply to different bits of legislation. And it's going to take all of these discussions, probably for a good number of years, before we know exactly where we are and before we can start to think about exactly, as a community, what we need to be doing about it.
Um, that makes sense. There, does it create an issue for? I know that you have said the Good Law Project is challenging the ruling. Um, does it make because the ruling is so vague? Does it make presenting legal challenges to it more difficult or less? Would you say?
So we're not challenging the ruling at this stage, right? As I say, because
Right.
no one knows
Yes.
what it means.
Hmm.
So what we're challenging the interim guidance. We
Right.
are confident. We are confident that the AHRC have gotten the law wrong.
Hmm.
Um, and we're challenging that, and that's what we're asserting in court is that they
Hmm.
have made all of these sweeping interpretations about the law, and in doing so, they acted and indeed encouraged others to act unlawfully. So that's why we are judicially reviewing that, and our case on that will be heard next week. Um, so that's a big challenge. But we're also bringing cases in a number of other areas
Hmm.
where we think that people have interpreted the law incorrectly, or if they haven't interpreted For Women Scotland incorrectly, then we argue we have found ourselves in a position where the law is incompatible with the European Convention on Human Rights, and we will be seeking declarations of incompatibility potentially in such cases. So we're looking at cases in a number of arenas. We're looking at things related to employment. We're looking at things related to services. We announced last week that we're bringing a cricket case. We think
Yes. I
the
don't want to ask about that.
we think the England and Wales Cricket Board, we think that their policy is unlawful. So we're sort of looking at all of the different areas of life now for trans people that have been impacted either by For Women Scotland itself, but more realistically by the misinterpretation and overinterpretation and
Mm.
overapplication for Women's Scotland. And we're basically pushing back on what we feel has been a massive intrusion into trans people's rights in this country.
So that makes a lot of sense. Is that then why, or maybe you could explain why, you have opted to challenge the interim guidance over challenging the sort of ruling itself? Is that kind of why? Because the interim guidance has actually provided more problems, or is there more to
I,
it than
I, I,
that?
th I think so. And I think because also, as I say, nobody really knows what for Women's Scotland means yet.
Mm,
And if for Women's Scotland really does mean all of the things that, if we're wrong, if Good Law Project are wrong, and for Women's Scotland does mean all of the things that anti-trans sort of activists say it means, that it requires some nationwide bathroom ban. If
mm.
they're right, and that is what for Women's Scotland means, and that's what the courts say it means, then absolutely we will be seeking to challenge that, yes.
Makes sense. So, as you may or may not know, I had a conversation with the Equalities Minister recently. Um, Within that conversation, I think she slightly disagreed with your characterization that no one really knows what it means. In fact, she said exactly to me that it was very clear that sex under the Equalities Act means biological sex, um, and then kind
I
of
mean, that is
continuously.
clear, but
Hmm,
what that means is unclear, right? Does
right.
that mean you can ban trans women from using the women's toilets? We don't think so.
Hmm,
We don't think
right.
that's a necessary implication of that. Um, does it mean that trans women might not be able to bring equal pay claims? I think that's probably more likely, and problematic in and of itself. But in terms of the, sex for the purpose of the Equality Act does mean biological sex. That will necessarily have problematic implications for trans people. But
Hmm.
just how problematic they are is on a very large scale at this point. There is a big difference between what we think the law is and between what other people are arguing the law is, which is a very extreme position that would infringe on trans people's rights on a daily basis.
In your kind of legal view, um, do you think that the ruling was clear about what it meant by biological sex?
So they didn't define it.
Sorry, my dog's going mental. I don't know if you can hear in the background.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on. I think we're okay. I think we're okay. Sorry, go on.
So they didn't define biological sex in the judgment, uh, but um, in in sort of the broad common law position on biological sex, there's a case called Corbett and Corbett,
Hmm.
and I think you have to assume that that's the definition that the Supreme Court are working on, and
And
that's a very old case.
right, and that would be birth sex, like sex assigned at birth would be the definition under that
It's
ruling.
slightly more complicated than that, actually.
Great. Okay.
Um, so, as far as the vast majority of people are concerned, yes, that means
Hmm.
sex is recorded at birth.
Hmm.
But for intersex people, it's slightly more complicated, which is, yes, as someone who happens to be an intersex person, I find this particularly fun.
Yeah.
So, Corbett and Corbett um, breaks down sex to mean three characteristics which um at birth, so if one has surgery or changes these characteristics, it doesn't count. It determines one's sex as a question of fact for the court based on um, gonadal, uh, uh, genital, and chromosomal. But the issue is, for intersex people, those three things don't always match, even at birth. So then the court can simply determine what someone is, and it might not be the same as what's registered at birth. That's, in my academic view, where we are.
Right, yeah, that doesn't seem like it makes a lot of sense.
It
Um,
doesn't, and it's not something that's accessible to the vast majority of people. So I think as a nice sort of as a general rule of thumb for most people, sex recorded at birth is probably a good proxy. But if you're into sex, it's slightly more complicated for you.
that sounds very unhelpful. There was something I did just want to clarify. There was a little bit of I don't even know if I want to call it a controversy, but certainly some confusion with the Good Law Project last year. Um, and there was a statement that was released basically saying that the Good Law Project weren't going to take on as many cases related to uh, trans rights. What kind of happened there? Was that a sort of confusion thing, or was it a sort of change decision? Because obviously you're taking on a lot of cases about trans rights now, so I'm kind of wondering what that was about.
So I think the organization had reached the conclusion that strategic litigation wasn't working to protect trans people's rights. Um, we were losing cases that we would usually think were really strong, and which all of our lawyers would think were really strong cases. But when we got to court, um, for some reason, that didn't seem to play out. And I think the general understanding was is that maybe we weren't exactly playing on an even playing field. And I think, were worried that what we were doing might actually even be making things worse rather than making things better. So at no point was it we don't care about trans people anymore. It was is this the best way to help trans people? Is the work we're doing in this area helping or is it harming? And I think the organization reached the conclusion that at the very least we needed to pause that work while we figured that out. Um, and then obviously April came. And I think there was a general understanding in the organization that no, someone needed to fight this, and we were pretty well placed to do so. And that at that point, in terms of what we could be usefully doing, our work was important and valuable, and the community needed us, and we wanted to step up for the community. So I'm really glad that we're doing this work again. I think it's so important right now that Good Law Project are here and able to do this work, particularly when, as I sort of said earlier, there is a real sort of absence of other people doing this kind of advocacy. So yes, I obviously I understand the community's sort of upset and distrust, and but I hope people know that we're here now and we're fighting and we'll continue to fight.
That makes a lot of sense. If if there are people watching this who um, want to take up the fight for trans rights and they agree that the legal path is the right way to do that, what what would you advise them to do? What's the kind of, is there a kind of get involved element? Outside of, obviously, I know you probably always need donations. But it's sort of in addition to that, what can people do if they want to support the Good Law Project?
So the thing to understand about Good Law Project, and it's something that we continually struggle with, is explaining what exactly it is we do as an organization. So we're a strategic litigation organization, and that's really different to something like a law clinic, or something similar. So the way a law clinic works is that they support a lot of individual people to bring cases and get support as individuals. So, um, if I know there are lots of trans people right now, for example, being told at work that they're no longer allowed to use the toilet or a disabled toilet, or indeed the toilet that matches their biological sex. So what a law clinic would do is it would support each of those individual trans people
Mhm.
and give them the legal support they needed. What we do at Good Law Project is really different.
Mm.
It's rather than us help 100 trans people, which is a random example, bring individual cases with a little bit of support or whatever. We look at those 100 cases and we pick the best one, the one we think is the strongest or will make the most difference. And we just go all in on that case, right? Because the whole point is not to try and change the world by helping lots of people individually, as valuable as that is, and as valuable as the work that law clinics do. It's to set precedents. It's like the case I spoke to you about earlier, right? We brought that case because now so many other trans people will be able to use that, and it will help so many more people because we were able to bring that really strong case and win. So that's what we're doing in terms of our response to for Women Scotland and all of the stuff that's happened since, is we're looking for these really, really strong cases. So by all means, people can tell us about their cases, but chances are you won't be the person that we end up taking a case forward with. What we really do need is resource. We try to put together the absolute best legal teams because God knows the other side do. Um, they're paying the best lawyers, they're intervening. We
And they
want to be
have the
able to
money
do
to
this.
do that.
Yeah, yeah. And whereas we rely on you. We rely on the community. We rely on regular donations to be able to keep bringing this work. And we were really, really lucky that so many people in the community came and gave us money to do this work following for Women in Scotland. And we've been able to use that resource to do some really good and really strong stuff already. But it one-off gifts get used up. So I think the point is that we need a regular and sustained income, right? So that we can continue to do this work, so that we can continue this fight because this fight is going to last years, as I said. But we plan to be here the whole time. So if you wanna help, that's honestly the best way.
Makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. Hello, me again. Still with wet hair, magic of TV and all that. Oh, my hand's disappeared. Okay, it's back. Great. Um, that was a good interview, I felt. And I want to thank Jess O'Thomson for coming along and being part of it. The Good Law Project for submitting them for scrutiny, and you for watching. If you like these interviews, go ahead and subscribe. And it also really helps when people share them. The last one really blew up because it got shared. So the more sharing we can get, uh, the more likely it is, the more people see it, and then I get to keep doing it, and I have a bigger audience, and you guys know how it works. So yeah, and leave me any questions you have if you have any follow-ups. Jess said I could message them with follow-ups. So if you've got anything you want me to ask them, I'll send it over. And otherwise, I hope you have a really good day. Thanks so much.